a band. You hear it?
It is necessary for the recording of sound to convert the sound waves to corresponding changes in light. The sound waves produced by my voice are transmitted through the air to the microphone, where these sound waves are converted to changes in an electric current. These variations in the electric current are then amplified and used to control the light. This varying beam of light falling on the photoelectric cell produces variations in the electric current, which are directly proportional to the variations in the light beam. The sound track. As the varying electrical current in the photoelectric cell is small, a vacuum tube amplifier is required to increase it to the point where it will operate a loudspeaker. Soundtrack.
Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to the Occult Rejects and Friends. Thank you all for hitting that play button and checking us out after our brief little intermission. Today, very special guest for me. I was thinking after coming back, after doing the little house cleaning and just, changing stuff with the show, I really didn't have time to really dig into a topic, but I was thinking like maybe I could get a guest on. And with this show, I do try to get into more in-depth stuff, bring topics that are going to be maybe more than one episode, do a little series on them. And I'm like, who could I ask for that? And I'm like, oh, Robby Marx. No brainer. And he's going to bring the heat. So here we are, back after a little hiatus for the Occult Rejects and Friends. I'm very proud to have on the first guest, first episode to drop. I got my amazing Canadian co-host with me, Teresa, and I got the amazing, talented artist, conspiracy theorist, whatever else he wants to call himself, mystic, the amazing Robby Marx. Robby, thank you so much for coming on again, my friend.
Yeah, for sure. It's always a good time.
Yeah, and it was nice to actually get you on this show instead of my show. I was even thinking about that before. I was like, how come I have never had him on this show?
Fold over. Hey, everything folds in its own time,
Yeah, so here you are. And before we get into this, could you just let people, for two things, let people know where they could find your stuff, because you do have your own podcast now. And if you don't mind letting people know what this show is going to be about as well.
Yeah, so you can find my stuff. I'm all over the web. I'm on most platforms. You can just Google RMarxArt, or actually I use Startpage, which is New Hampshire based, and it keeps no records as far as what you search or anything. And it's totally anonymous. Oh. So Startpage is great. But then let's see. I'm also I have my Etsy store, which is RMarxArt. And then I also have now, I just started releasing my Meta Mindcast, which is a series of interviews I've been doing with various other podcasts, as well as some of my own recordings, my own personal research mixed in. And that you can just search Meta, METTA, Mindcast, all one word. And it should pop up on most of the major pod servers.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And all the links for that will be in the show notes as well.
Nice.
And I can't forget, Teresa, what's going on? Maybe not everybody knows. Well, I don't know. You have been on the Occult Rejects before, so the listeners should know who you are by now, even if they haven't listened to my own show. So would you like to say what's up and plug your stuff and let everybody know who you are, just in case they don't know who you are?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on this show. It's exciting times. But yeah, so I think I was on Occult Rejects for the clothing lines.
Yes, maybe one other thing, but I know at least that show, yes.
Yeah, at least that. And then, so we have another show together called Spiritual Gangsters. So that's like a little bit different than this, a little more personal, and talk about like transformation, spiritual questions, issues, pop culture sometimes, things like that. So like this week we just had an episode drop about Kanye West, which is fun, with Colorado Dank, who's the best. And yeah, so it's a lot of fun. Please check it out. And people can also find me on Instagram. That's where I'm at the most. But yeah, all that stuff's probably in the links, I guess.
Yes, they will be. Yes, so they'll make sure that they are. And not to put Robby on the spot, but was just thinking he'd be a perfect guest too for Spiritual Gangsters. I'm just thinking his art, the occultism.
I thought about it before, but I know he's very, very busy artiste, so it'll happen if he's open to it.
When it comes around, I'm open to a lot.
Perfect.
So, yeah, definitely.
And I'm excited for this because Robby always has so much to say. I have like my lecture pad ready, like my notes. Pen. I don't know
I actually brought a pen with me
so
too.
I'm like, I'm just ready to take notes.
And well, I think what we really have to, kind of realize with the Egyptian stuff is that putting a lot of this stuff together. I was just talking to Grub, and we were talking about,
nice.
Some of the transition times in Egypt, and it's like so many pieces like that you have to like assemble from 1,000 different places to kind of begin to get a cohesive picture of kind of what this, because you have the Roman times, you have the prehistory times, and then you have the misty times, where basically formation was coming in, and you have the establishment of these base, gods. And so what we're going to talk about today is basically the formation mythos of the Egyptians as far as how reality came into being. And then we're going to talk about the major characters in the Egyptian mysteries, which basically revolve around Osiris and Isis. And then we also have Set and Nephthys. And then that leads us to Horus. So we're going to basically cover up to the initial 4, Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. And then we're also going to cover Thoth, who's a major character. And then for the next one, we'll separate out, and then we'll go through the mysteries on the next one.
You know what's funny? You mentioned these Egyptian gods, and I'm looking at my computer. It was so funny. I want to thank the listeners for real. I probably got up about half of the money I needed for a $2,000 computer. When I went to go get this computer for the show, I literally just typed in the requirements that is needed for the program that I use to do the video, and just made sure that the computer was able to handle that. And like I really didn't go crazy, but like I kind of very few came up. It was just a gaming computers really. That was the only thing with that. And I didn't even notice until after I bought the computer, and now the company's constantly either emailing me, or now their advertisements are just popping up on everything that I go on.
They want to be in your life.
Yeah. And I'm like, yo, they got a Horus computer. And then I'm like, wait, mine's a Set computer. Like, I didn't even realize that when I ordered it and it said Set, it literally is the Set, the god, the Egyptian god. And I started looking through their computers, and they're all named after Egyptian gods. And I was like, only me. And I didn't even realize I was doing it.
What company is it?
Yo, right?
What company is it? Your
CLX.
Computer? Oh.
Yeah.
So sorry to interrupt you, but I just thought that was weird.
And then when you go online and you're clicking through the stuff, you have to submit.
Oh. That's pretty funny. That's interesting.
Yeah.
It's something I wanted to ask you about this Egyptian stuff. You had mentioned it before. I have often wondered, sometimes you can see, like you were saying, in difference in times, even stuff with the art or God's names, or which ones might have been more prevalent at that time. Have you ever wondered if it's like you're being told almost the same thing, but in a different dialect now because somebody else is telling their twist of it?
Yeah, and I think if you go through and you look back through the Chaldean and the Phoenician and a lot of these Mesopotamian philosophies, the Sumerian, they all entail aspects relating to Egypt and this story of the dying and risen God is something that you consistently see throughout all cultures.
It's almost like the hero's, what is that? The hero's tale, or whatever they call it.
The hero's journey.
Yeah. It's almost something like that as well.
Well, and it's kind of the Jungian philosophy of going into, the dark or doing the shadow work, basically, and then being born. It's the whole Ben bird, the phoenix, where essentially, what is it? Every 500 years, the phoenix dies, and then from its own ashes, it kind of rises, and so it's and I think that, even when you look more holistically, like cosmically, the sun of being Ra in the Egyptian, basically was seen to die essentially every day. And then the sun would be in the underworld and be reborn every morning. Mm-hmm. So it's this conceptual process, and then you have the fire at night. So you have the two diametric flames of the flame of the day and the flame of the night, and there was different operation methods with those flames, so it's just interesting, but that all comes down to the death and the consistent rebirth, which and it's the alchemical as above so below. So if they see the systems, then the gods function like the outer systems, and hence you have this death and rebirth pattern consistently coming around,
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
We're seeing that a lot right now, like in the current times, a lot of symbolism with that, right? Especially around the number 8 and the phoenix and whatnot.
It's but I just think that diametrically through the whole fractaline hologram, that it's like just part of the programming of what it is to be human. I mean, us, as ourselves, even, we're born into the world, the world's a mystery, and then we die, and then the concept of life after death or being reborn, it's but even within all the religions, the idea of they have the reborn this and the reborn that, and like George W. Bush, they asked him if he was reborn, and and even within Mithraism, once you get, have that sacrificial bull, that blood is the essential sacrifice, that is the fluid that allows, the system to regenerate and come anew. And back to the blood in the ground, back to Cain and Abel, spilling the blood, that blood in the ground facilitates nutrients, which put forth new shoots. So you have this consistent dying and rebirth, the snake shedding its skin, and its many lives. Yeah. So
I like that.
I wonder, just thinking because of what you were saying, I wonder if like a battlefields or like maybe places where like a large amount of people die. I mean, that does sound creepy, but do they those areas tend to grow better vegetation? Is that actually like fertilizer? Could blood and human remains actually like be good fertilizer?
Well, and as
weird as that sounds.
Oh yeah, no. If you have a garden, right? Mm-hmm. Anybody that grows a garden, when you go to the farm and feed store, you get blood meal and you get bone meal, and these are things that you put on your garden for nutrients. So I mean, and then you look at like Gettysburg or any of these places where mass amounts of blood has been spilled on the ground. I would imagine it would, but also, during when Cain killed Abel, and Yahweh comes and he's like, the blood cries out to me from the ground, so, and it was always traditionally seen that the spilling of the blood on the ground, like when you spill a drink for your homies.
I was just going to say that. Is that the same thing?
Yeah. Basically you're spilling it onto the ground and you're giving it to the ancestors, and even in a lot of Mesopotamian and even up into Roman times, some of the Britannia, and they actually would have under the dining table, they would bury their dead under the house, right? And they would have feeding tubes where they would actually pour, like to their dead. So they would
What?
feed the dead in the underworld. So it's this consistent practice of giving the dead in the underworld sustenance so that they can maintain their substance and not be forgotten, not be lost in the sands of time. So it was this idea of preserving them in your memory, giving them actual physical sustenance.
Do you think
and
maybe they thought it kept them tethered in a sense to that body still and didn't totally get to float out?
You wonder, because like if somebody's trying to ascend, it's like, why you keep
stop leaving me food. I want to get out of here.
Stop feeding me.
I don't give a shit about your honey and myrrh anymore.
Right. So, but that's the whole thing, when you get into the idea of this underworld or this netherworld, it relates right into the primordial foundings of how reality came into existence, right? So in Egypt, you have the nether, right, which was the nether world, or it's similar to being neutered, neuter, which means to remove or to be in a state of absence where nothing exists. So you're basically in the void, right?
I was just thinking the same word, the void.
Right. And so this was where in the nether, this was essentially where the Egyptian gods dwelt. So you have this idea of them being, much like Enki in the Absu or the abyss. The nether, it actually means gods or spirit or soul. So you almost have like this cosmic soul that exists in the nothingness.
You mentioned the Absu?
The Absu, yeah.
Yeah, and that's what the word for the abyss?
That's like Enki in the Sumerian text. The Absu is the abyss.
This is how random my mind is. I don't know if it's because I'm stoned or what, or I do think like sometimes just random stuff.
Oh
yeah. Morbid Angel Covenant album. I remember them mentioning, I think, Absu on there.
Absu.
And I never understood, even as a kid, because like back in the day, you used to get these albums, they actually had the lyrics in them. So you could see exactly the crazy shit they were saying. I read all that stuff and I was like, what the hell are all these names? Where is this stuff coming from? You know, and I do know that's funny that I have like, I think even watched a few interviews about them to see like what they were kind of into. And one of them was heavily into Sumerian and Kabbalah. So now you said Absu, I remember for a fact hearing that in one of their songs. So there you go. And there's
that's
Sumerian.
the abyss. Yeah. Talking about dwelling in the abyss,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And as a vinyl head, I appreciate the album artwork and the fold outs and the inserts, all the submersive experience that you can't get from all this digital stuff, and even the CDs kind of ruined a lot of that,
Yeah, that was cool stuff. It's like you got something and it was like a journey you took as you listened to it. You read everything, you looked at it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Enhance the whole experience, right?
Right.
It was like Ralphie when he had his little Dakota pin trying to on Christmas Story. You're like immersing yourself into the whole thing.
Yeah. And well, that's the process of being initiated into these things oftentimes that people don't even realize that they're participating with,
Yeah. Actually, when you're describing what you were just saying before, it made me think of this old video game I used to have on like the computer, like on a Windows computer, called the Neverhood.
Oh yeah.
Have you guys heard of it?
Yeah, I solved it.
It's like claymation. Yeah, I was like obsessed with this game, and it's all about like going through the underworld and like
puzzles. And,
I was obsessed with it. I played it when I was like 12.
Well, and that kind of also gets into the idea of the Egyptians, like after you die, you take the path of Osiris, where you basically go through the underworld and travel through the cosmos, and you have to go through all these gates. Where you have to know the signs and the symbols and the passwords, and otherwise you get lost in the abyss or that the Absu.
Exactly.
So now these gods in the nether, right? They were essentially neutered or sexless, right? And let's see.
That's like the who are those sullied on
The Unsullied.
The Unsullied. Yeah.
In Game of Thrones. Even when Robbie was describing like feeding the blood and like to the dead, I was like, that's like Game of Thrones when they clean their sword to the certain those trees. I forget what those trees are called. Remember?
I stopped watching Walking Dead when they started killing people instead of zombies.
Oh no, we're talking about
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones.
They clean off their swords in front of these certain trees, and then they say that the blood feeds the tree.
Yeah, and they have the faces.
The ones with the faces. Weirwood tree. That's what they call it.
That, to me, that was very druidic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Robbie, you can blame me for Walking Dead because I'm probably the last person. I was probably the only person to watch them for the last 5 years. And they just kept it going for me. I'm sorry. Because they really killed that show, but I still watched it.
Yeah. That's, I mean, I don't know, it depends on how attached we get to these things. Yeah. There's, it's hard to get past some things when they're a part of your essence, at certain parts of your life, it's, so now within this netter world, right? All of these gods were animated and existed within the all-encompassing mother Ma'at, right? And Ma'at is essentially where we get the word matter. So, birthing forth from the void, coming into form, like in that transition, right? Now, in this netter world was essentially like the void of the chaos. And, we hear a lot of the talk about the monsters swimming in the depths and, these various forms of chaos that are shadowy forms within the waters of the void, in different cultures we hear about this, right? In the Egyptians, there was actually 8 of these shadowy forms that were participating with this water of the void, right? And they were called the Ogdoad, right? And they're oftentimes seen as like frogs or bullfrogs, basically perched around the edge of these waters of chaos, right? So when we have this whole, when you see Kek within the modern memes,
yes.
I think that they're relating back to these frogs that are existing around this this water of chaos, and we do actually have the names of these different frog entities, right? That are persisting with this chaos. You have.
I do want to add real quick, and I'm sure you've probably heard me say it plenty of times, but it's funny how you're saying right now the frog is kind of associated with chaos, right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's exactly what I keep saying all the time about this movie Mother with an exclamation point.
Right. When you see the frog
jumps. Yeah, the frog. She opens up the door. The frog jumps through. She closes the door, and now it's like World War III in 5 minutes in the house.
Yep. And I think if a lot of shows, when the frogs show up, that things do begin to get chaotic. And even in Egypt, one of the plagues, they have the frogs come in. So it's the frog is, and I don't know,
a few years after Pepe, it definitely got chaotic.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And you got to wonder, where that came from and what that really was and how those meme acts on, they act on the psyche. Because a lot of people really take these things almost to the extent of being religious about it, as far as taking on the Kek personification, taking on, it's, it's pretty wild, man.
I've even said just recently, we had Lee from Inner Guardians on my show. Mm-hmm. Great episode. People haven't listened to it, go check it out. We got onto talismans and sigils for like real quick, and I had even said I have wondered like if somehow like deep back in the dark parts of our mind, do we all just kind of like run on like symbolisms and shapes and like geometry kind of?
Oh yeah.
And like do some symbols that are just used, regardless if you even know what the hell it even means. Is it going to trigger something in you anyway?
Primal.
Because like somehow like your mind or your consciousness still acknowledges that, even though you have no idea.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's the whole point of symbolism.
Yeah.
Well, usually, right?
And I almost feel like some of these symbols have been around so long, going back to pre-Diluvian times even. And, you got the whole monarch program with the Nazis. And it's just interesting, the idea of genetic memory and how, it's like a baby, chicken. When they first hatch, if they're out in the backyard walking around, if they see a hawk fly overhead, they will automatically drop down. And it's instilled in them, like genetically, the knowledge of those predators. And even with mice in laboratories, there is some evidence that they can teach a mouse to run the maze, and then its offspring already have some pre-knowledge of the pattern of the maze. So, it's interesting. And then you look at the idea of suppressing that, through the many machinations of dividing us from ourselves that modern society, feed us. It makes you wonder, because even with, MK Ultra, and working with Project Monarch and getting into all that stuff, it gets pretty interesting when you start looking at the ideas of genetic memory,
Yeah, even you talking about Monarch and, bringing it back to what the topic was. That can go back to a butterfly, which again, is a symbol of death and rebirth.
Oh, yeah. Well, but that's where the Project Monarch actually comes from, is the monarch butterfly.
And doesn't that migrate to Mexico? Don't they?
Right.
So I just saw that recently, and it reminded me. I knew that before, and I was like, there's got to be something behind that, too, with Monarch.
And it will take generations of those butterfly to reach back to their breeding ground, and then essentially once they go down there and do their thing, then they turn around and they fly back north, but it's through multiple generations, and somehow they seem, and you could get into global magnetic patterns, like the birds with the hematite in their brains, kind of following the patterns of the earth as far as flying north and south. But it's the belief that there is essentially, through that the study of the monarch butterfly, it's the belief that there is genetic memory. So, I think that over the course of many millennia, that these symbols have been used and instilled in what we are, and it's almost to the point that it's part of the structure of the matrix itself, and how the programming of the physical reality is, as far as the geometry and especially when you get into sigils and, you take the name and you follow and you create, and then that's the base symbol, and then you go and that entity will essentially give you an even more, detailed method of contacting them. So I think that these geometries and these types of angles and arcs, are part of the inherent human programming of who we are, and in recognition of symbols, Yeah.
I've always wondered that too, with like past lives, how much of it is past lives and how much of it is ancestral memory.
Yeah. Well, and that's the whole thing, there used to be like a, mimetic hallucinogenic honey that they would basically, fill the body with this honey and then gestate mushrooms in it. And then they would roll the body over and drain the honey out. And it was like this putrefied kind of blue honey. And then when the initiates would take the honey, they would essentially get the powers of their ancestor and that connection to the universe. So it was believed that they were actually assimilating the knowledge and the power and the into themselves.
Some Black Panther shit.
Yeah.
I'm glad the OTO never handed me a cup of blue honey.
Yeah.
Out of here with that shit.
So now these gods, or these not gods, but these frog entities that existed within the chaos, right? We have formlessness, right, which were represented by Huk and Hukt, Huk and Hukt, And then we have darkness, which was represented by Cuck and Kukt, K-U-K and K-U-K-T, right? And then we have hiddenness, which was represented by Amun and Amunt. And then we have the waters, which were represented by Nun. And then we have the consort of the waters, which was Nunet. So these were the 8 essential frogs that were participating and swimming in this chaos before time and space came to be.
You said, did you mention Huck as the first one?
H-U-K, yeah. Being formlessness. Huck and Huck.
I just recently, not too long ago, and I probably would have never even have caught this if I didn't cover it. I covered Edward Lansdale, and he was like a CIA, like he was kind of like the Aquino before Aquino.
Yeah,
in a sense.
Dude, he's an interesting character.
Oh hell yeah, I covered it on my own and just did a short for like 45 minutes. I could have easily have done hours on this guy, but he was part of like a psyop in the Philippines that was trying to mind screw with the Huck Rebellion. The H-U-K Huck Rebellion that they were saying were communists that were basically just farmers who were like, I'm not down with your fascism, get the hell out of here. Yeah, that's all they really were. But they labeled them the Hucks. So that's really interesting.
And you got to wonder if that's what they called themselves or if that's what the
that's somebody else gave them.
Chose the name to give them. But and when you see in the movie Apocalypse Now, right, when the helicopters are flying with the speakers and they're blaring the music, they weren't blaring music in the actual case. They were actually they had speakers set up. And they were putting out like these swirling, haunting.
I played some of the tape on the show. Yeah, it was some weird stuff.
Oh yeah.
Oh my god, it was like echoes and like voices layered, and them telling them they're gonna be cursed or weird shit.
Yep. And that was the dead coming back and getting into their vampiric mythos.
I think they were like saying like we help them and we can't leave until they're destroyed or something like that. So you got to stop helping them.
And again, that comes back to the ideas of perception. It's like, what do you take into your mind as a belief system? It's the old concept of the reality tunnel, that Robert Anton Wilson talks about. It's like, and they've even taken case studies, where they've switched conservatives with liberals, news sources. And usually after about 3 to 4 weeks, the conservative will be a complete liberal and the liberal will be a complete conservative. So it's, we really have to be conscious of what we allow to enter into our mind and consciously participate with it rather than just allowing it to flow through us, without being aware of it,
I mean, listen, I'll even say, just from being on social media, I don't know if it's because of QAnon or whatever it was, but like I watched people like on the right for years go on about like certain, trannies and this and that, bashing whatever. And then all of a sudden Caitlyn Jenner says I might run for whatever as a Republican, and everybody just totally forgot what they were saying about that dude probably 3 days ago in their own freaking account. All of a sudden,
the party line.
I'm like, how did that just happen?
Yeah. Well, and I find it interesting also, that like through the course of going into Ukraine, all of the liberals that have, traditionally been anti-war, are all behind. It's just interesting how they, through weaponized anthropology, they essentially use our own, heart against our self.
Oh yeah, yes. I watched New York within a matter of weeks basically trade in De Blasio for a black Trump, in my opinion. Yeah. I mean, like, all you got is a guy up there who just runs his mouth. He blames the news for lying, too, just like Trump does. Yep. He doesn't really seem to do much. He loves himself and talks about himself and thinks he's the shit. I'm like, you literally just voted in the same person you've been shitting on for the last 4 years as for our president. Well, but since he's black, it's okay, and he's a Democrat. But it's the same personality. You're getting the same person.
Yeah. Well, and at a certain point, they're all co-opted, But again, this all comes down to the idea of theater, and I think even going back to a lot of what these godheads were, these gods and demigods on earth, this was essentially a form of theater, for the propagation and maneuvering of mass populations, And I think we see that consistently, just the migration and the different, similarities and the gods changing names, moving from one culture to another, and even early on when Kush brought the Ethiopian religion into Egypt, in Ethiopia, they said that the Ethiopians were like a simple people that had a beautiful life. And then when Kush came in and he set up and established the worship of the gods, they became like basically just bound up in the ideas of what the theater was, rather than participating with the beauty of the earth as they had been, So, when we bring these mind memes in, much like Keck and much like, all these, memes essentially started through military intelligence, and I make some memes every now and then. I think they're funny. A lot of people, they don't, but whatever, man. It's just, like all of us, we look into the void and we try to find something within ourselves, so that we have some sort of semblance of what we think reality is, and I think that all these different memes, from the political memes to the religious memes to, whatever it is you want to get into, Pokemon or magic, or, they're all some sort of thing where we're trying to find some truism that we can see within ourselves, So, but that's the thing, a lot of these forces, they're not there to help you. They're there to basically take your energy and maneuver it and use it for their own forces, and I wonder how much, like the apotheosis of George Washington in the Capitol Dome, it's like, how much is it with the belief in this propagation of this Roman state, precipitates into the manifestation of a new form of a thought form, being this risen God of George Washington in his new apotheosized state. Are we still in the process of like in 1,000 years, are they going to be like this George Washington character, and you read some of the Native American stuff, and like, they couldn't shoot him with arrows. Like, he was impervious to bullets. Like, there's all kinds of even, like godlike mythos in his early. So, what is theater and what is reality, Yeah.
So nothing's changed, basically.
Nothing's changed. Nothing new under the sun, ever.
Yeah. That's crazy.
So now, within these 8 frog entities, right? One of them, Amun, right? Who was the hiddenness of the chaos, right? He basically steps out there's a pillar of light that rises out of the chaos. Okay. And this is the same story that we see as far as the circumpunct, as far as the chaos and the electric light of Lucifer shining forth that Theosophy talks about, as far as illuminating, illuminating 7 billion, heavens. Basically, it's the idea of this this light emerging from chaos, or the idea of the Big Bang, even, something coming from nothing, right? And from this pillar of light that came out of this void, Amun basically stepped out of the pillar of light, and he stepped onto a primordial mound, like in the sea of chaos. So, he basically what is Robert Flood? He says that, the darkness illuminated itself in order to attain consciousness, you know? So basically, this is like the first, almost like the Atom Cadman of the Platonic universals, where this is the original form in the heavens that would be the template for the building of what the human was on the earthly plane, right?
You know what's wild? I got to stop you there because you're just saying more and more that I wanted to add to.
Yeah.
As you're talking about this, you're talking about Amun, right?
Right, Amun.
Amun Ra would go with Chesed, which is the fourth sphere on the tree of life. In my opinion, that is the first sphere that comes out of coming into this world. The third would be, crossing into or coming into this world. So four is also a good way to explain Chesed, the difference between Chesed and Binah. In my opinion, Binah would be the thought of the chair. Chesed would be the blueprint of the chair. Yeah. Just like you just said, the blueprint of man. So like I can see the resemblance how Chesed also, when you mentioned electricity, is a lower arc of Chokmah. I do think that Chesed is like the abundance of energy coming into this world. And when you cross over into the abyss, I think that energy starts to become as raw as electric.
Right.
So like everything you're saying, I can actually see it matching up with the tree of life with the way I look at it. So it's actually pretty wild and bizarre.
Also, this pillar of light, right? If you trace that pillar of light, one of the terms for a pillar of light is a Lucas. Or Lucas. So when you have George Lucas, that
his
last
lightsaber.
name, yeah, and he has the pillar, the lightsaber.
Yeah.
Also
Oh man.
Yeah, so Lucas actually means pillar of light.
Oh wow.
Oh, I gotta tell that to Conspiracy Kyle.
And then you think, Robby, too, that's what an obelisk could represent?
Yeah, the obelisk.
I know it's with the myth of Osiris, right?
Osiris, right. But it is very much a pillar or a shaft.
Yeah. Either one.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's and then also now Amun, he calls himself the hidden one, right? And later on, we see when Nimrod the Elder in Virgil, he talks about Latinus showing up and talking to Juno, and Juno sends Latinus to Italy to set up, and Latinus is the hidden one as well, which becomes Latin and is the foundation of the Latin language.
I was going to say, is that where Latin language comes from?
Yeah, directly. Yeah.
Wow.
So there's, and Lee and I on Subconscious Realms, we've been going into, after the fall of the Tower of Babel, how essentially Phineas Farside, brought the Firbolg into Ireland and bringing the Celtic language. And then you have Nimrod the Elder going into Italy, bringing the Latinus language. And, there's even mentions of Kali at the Tower of Babel in the Book of Invasions. There's mention. So, it's just interesting to see when the tongues were divided and how these different languages, and again, back to Latinus, calling himself the hidden one, just like Amun,
What did you say about Phineas? And then there was a companion you said as well?
Oh, Phineas Fairside. That was, he was basically the guy that brought the Firbolg into Ireland to overthrow the Tutankhamun.
Oh, because there's a really popular Disney cartoon called Phineas and Ferb.
Huh.
And that was a show for a long time. It's an odd name, right? To use.
Phineas,
Yeah. And Ferb is his companion.
Right. Yeah, I bet you there's got to be something there if you dig deep enough,
Probably.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So now this Amun character, right, who eventually we do see linking in with Ra, becoming Amun Ra and basically being the sun, right? But now Amun and Atum, they came together, right? And they basically produce children, right? But let's see. I I passed up Ma. Let's talk about Ma real quick for a second. Or actually, let's just go into Amun.
Okay.
200.
Yeah, I think I threw you off with Mont. I interrupted you
Yeah,
and screwed you a little.
I wasn't paying attention. I need to pay more attention to my notes.
Well,
Sounds good.
man.
Yeah. So let's see. Amun was okay. So yeah, Amun, we talked about him already as being the hidden one, right? Basically, I was going to go into Atum, and Atum was called Atem or Tim, right? And he basically, or it. Now you got to figure it's. They have no sexes at this point, right? So these are just sexless energies that are in the netter or the nether world, right? And Atum, Atem or Tim created itself by saying its name. So basically, through the course of, and here we have the idea of the power of the vocal element as far as bringing things into form through our own, saying them, right? And that's why a lot of mantras and like people, will constantly say things to themselves. And I think that the speaking is one of the fundamental methods of intoning that vibration into reality. That is the beginning of the process of manifesting and bringing forth actual form, So let's see. And Atum is associated with the evening sun, and Atum is also said to be born from a blue lotus. And if you get into the blue lotus in Egypt, right, it actually has some amphetamine-like qualities, and it also has some hallucinogenic qualities. And basically, it was a common plant that was smoked or ingested during this time to achieve altered states of consciousness. And even in some of the stuff based around Solomon's Temple, we see blue lotuses. So the blue lotus was a sacred plant, and Atum was basically born from this blue lotus. And sometimes he's also shown as a serpent, or a mongoose, a lion, a bull, a lizard, or an ape. So
yeah, that's a lot of different things.
Yeah.
A snake and a mongoose. Mongoose eats snakes.
Right.
That's weird.
Right. So
and what's interesting, Robbie, even that sphere that I mentioned before, Chesed, that I think, you probably know this. It's a blue sphere too. So you keep mentioning blue as well, like the blue lotus.
The blue lotus.
That'll be very interesting.
And yeah, it's interesting because I think that the better magicians or the better alchemists are really good at layering the symbolism in such a manner that the more symbols that interrelate to the thing you're working on, the more symbols you can stack up on top of it, the more powerful that force generator becomes. You know what I'm saying?
Yes,
so it's interesting to see, and this is some of the most, ancient magic going back. And you look at the Ka and the Ba, being the soul and the copy of the soul that you take with you as you travel Osiris's path, much like Jacob's ladder, essentially ascending, into the higher realms. And the Ka and the Ba, and then you have the Ankh, which is life itself. And I think that is essentially where you get Kabbalank or Kabbalah, And I think there's a direct carryover there as far as when you have the Exodus and those Ibiru basically leaving Egypt and becoming the Israelites, Yeah. Yeah. So let's see. Now let's get into this character, Ma'at or Ma, right? Which becomes directly related to Ma'at. Ma'a in the beginning was the truth. Okay. So, and from the very first emergence of the first thought, which was the path. Okay. And the path was the breather on these waters of the chaos. Okay. And this path is also the breath that was breathed into the bread that made it rise, much like the leavening of the bread, right? So, and that is essentially the idea of giving the breath to the human, right? Coming from Ma, right? And then the breath, once the humans have the breath is actually associated with Set or Typhoon, being that wind force that is blowing and moving and directing and forcing, So here we already have, within the speak, and that's why with speaking, it can be positive or negative, it's the force generator. It's basically a tool, and Set, we'll talk about, in the beginning he was good, and later he ended up becoming this idea of this almost like Satan character,
Well, I've even seen stuff from like magicians or people into Kabbalah or whatever when they cover the word peh or the letter peh in Hebrew. That they even say, how like all those things represent something. I think that might represent a tooth or whatever. Or people will say it can represent like teeth or a tongue, but they associate it with speech. And they say that it actually can be like a double-edged sword. It's a weapon as well. That's even acknowledged. Like that way.
Yeah. And you also have to wonder how much, like when Jesus talks about returning with a sword, if that sword is indeed the tongue, in regard to people actually having the courage to be able to call out the lies and the fallacies, it's definitely interesting when you get into all these different symbols and how they interact, So this truth of Ma became Ma'at, or matter, right? And it was through the course of creating truth and justice and this divine law of order that allowed the creation to facilitate, basically using the forces of Heka or magic in regard to the overall turning of the creation that Ma'at was bringing into form,
And you mentioned before that she is associated with truth. I would assume that's why she's also associated with the scales then.
Yes, and justice as well.
Yeah.
Cosmic justice, and tracing, truth and justice. I mean, that could be a whole show on itself, man. All the different, symbolic representations and the different goddesses that, but it is mostly related to the divine feminine aspect, where we see the ideas of truth and justice and balance, because almost like the idea of the Leviathan being killed and salted and being the creation of matter itself, in order for physics essentially to happen, there has to be a divine, justice, a divine, equilibrium, for the scales, so that reality can even exist. Because, like they say, if one little thing was off, none of this could have manifested. It's it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, one thing I did want to mention too when you mentioned Mott, and this is kind of like totally off of what you were saying, but it is something I have thought about recently, and just looking at like a lot of the metals when you look on the Tree of Life. She is associated, I think, with brass, or you can use copper, but I think brass is more of her thing. Brass, copper, silver, and gold all conduct electricity. And then if you look at other metals that are on other sides of the tree, they all work real well with gravity. Very heavy.
Yeah.
So you have, and you have to wonder about that. Why is it so heavy? Maybe it's just really stuck here in this world. Yeah, and then you have electricity, which is something like very different. It's just...
Well, and almost the heaviness moves down and the etheric aspects of electricity move up.
Yes.
So you have this, again, the yin and the yang, the cyclic, the positive, the balance.
I even think sometimes like on the world card where there's like kind of like that whole circle. I think you can see that in a sense, or even with maybe that zodiac sign.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Now, so from Amun and Atum, right? They gave birth to Shu and Tefnut. Okay. And Shu is essentially air. And if we take the alchemical symbol for air, it's the triangle with the line through it, right? And then Tefnut was moisture, which we can associate with water, which is the downward facing triangle. Mm-hmm. So essentially, we're already taking alchemical elements of the upward movement of the air and the downward movement of the moisture, and we're combining them together to facilitate creation or manifestation.
Yo, that's amazing right there. I just want to add, like, I've even tried to explain that on my own show recently. I think it might have been talking about with peaks. I don't know what it was, but I was saying that, like, one side you have fire, one side you have water, in the middle pillar you have air. Air rises. When does it start to fall? When it gets condensed, turns into a cloud, turns into the water, and then falls back down.
Right.
You can literally, that's the same way I think the spirit works.
Yeah. Helter skelter, man. So now with Shu and Tefnut, we have this upward and downward facing triangle, right? And their children were Geb and Nuet, okay? And Geb is earth, which is the downward facing triangle with the line through it. And then Nuet is sky, which in the sky we have the sun, which is the fire symbol. So again, we have the downward facing and the upward, but opposite of Shu and Tefnut. So we have, the two forms bringing and merging opposite of each other. And through that, that manifestation, they brought forth Isis, Osiris, Set, and Nephti, right? And Geb and Nuit were the parents, earth and sky were the parents of these first primordial gods that were essentially in the physical world itself.
Well, this is very much like the Greek story of like Uranus and Gaia, and then they birthed the main gods.
Yes. And you almost have to, with the Greek, the different philosophers within Greece going to Egypt to participate in the mysteries. You almost, even in the Greek culture, there is a reference to one of the offspring of Kronos as being Osiris. So, you have a direct, and then there was also other links we'll get into later that they associated other gods as well with Osiris.
Yeah, and I think there is one mythological story where the Greek gods like take animal forms and then flee to Egypt.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And that's same story in Ethiopia as well, where they basically went to Egypt to hide out. And there's a direct correlation between all these animal-headed gods and Ethiopian gods and all the animal-headed gods in Egypt and the Greek gods. So you see these, what's it called? Correspondences directly. Yeah, correlations. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Everyone goes to hide in Egypt, even Jesus.
Right.
When he was a baby.
Yeah. It's,
hideout.
So now let's see. Let me get to where we're at here. Okay, so let me get to, now we're going to talk about Isis.
Oh yeah.
So Isis, she has the whole idea that no one may ever lift her veil and see her true energies, as far as, because it's beyond the understanding essentially of the human mind, to conceptualize the idea of all of creation and balance and all the, justice in the world, from the negative happenings to the positive happenings, and just nature itself. I mean, nature itself is the divine mystery, that we sprung forth from, so Isis.
Real quick, Robbie, I was like sitting here laughing because as you were saying that, the first thing that popped into my head was Dave Matthews Band when he's telling her, lift up your skirt and show the world to me. I've often thought that that's exactly all that song is talking about.
I was obsessed with that song.
That because it reminds me very much of Green is the Color by Pink Floyd. Again, he's talking about a woman in the light shining through a dress.
Yep.
You gotta pull open that veil to peek back to see what's going on.
Into it. And oftentimes people that delve into this void, you either come back in one of two states. You either come back with the heightened awareness and consciousness, or you come back completely insane.
You're Kanye West. That's over and abusing those experiences.
Well, you gotta wonder what they were, as far as that handler and putting him in, what they were actually like putting him on, as far as.
See, that's the whole thing. It's like, was this done to him? Did he do it to himself? It's like, so I can't even like. That guy, it's such a rabbit hole to try to figure out.
Well, I think on a certain level, as a young, eager artist, you're looking for a doorway into the system. And the people that are offered that, it's the whole Faustian bargain, man, and the fact that this guy's calling out Kanye on Twitter and talking about, we're going to throw you back in the institution. And he's directly related to, the Canadian, operations during the time of MK Ultra. And it's just interesting, man, again, coming back to the theater, and using these rock idols, these demigods on earth, to basically take people's attention,
You nailed it right there.
Yeah.
Demigods on earth. Wow.
Yeah. But even like, William Burroughs, he used to talk about the fact that like the Mayan, or the pyramids in general, but the Mayan pyramids mostly is what he talked about, were attention stealers. They were essentially to take you away from nature and to bring you into this system of human machinations, and the Mayan calendar, every day you would wake up and it tells you what the symbols are. And then those are the things that you're supposed to think about on that day, and the way that you're supposed to act and participate with reality. So, William Burroughs says that the Mayan calendar was one of the first mind control devices on the planet,
I say that's very like programming.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But what do? We wake up and, we do our 10 minutes of browsing through social media, and then all the news of the day basically tells us all the things that we need to gestate on and to build up our 10 minutes of hate, so that we can go do our job and take our soma and participate in the machine. It's
It's the cog in the wheel,
It's I hate to sound too, but dude, I had the corporate job back in the day, man, and it's a soul killer,
For sure.
Yeah.
What's what we're seeing right now with that Buffalo Bills player, DeMar Hamlin? I don't know what is going on with that, but there is something afoot. It is not kosher.
I noticed like a lot of weird stuff with numbers and stuff with that.
Yeah, well, and just the idea, like you were saying, Robbie, about like celebrities and athletes being like demigods on earth. And I think that's especially true of football, because they are like these gladiators. It reminds me of like the gladiatorial arena very much.
Bread and circus.
Right. And like that he gets hit, he basically died on the field. Basically. And now I don't know if he's really alive or not, but like they're making it seem like this whole resurrection story, holding up the hearts, the 3 and 6 is everywhere.
Yep.
God, it's just like, damn.
This whole heart thing, I'm also starting to notice a lot of bots on Instagram and Twitter that are adding me that have this earth on the bottom with a little red heart on it. And for some reason, I'm like, something's up with that. and I'm not sure what it is, but I keep having to block them.
Yeah, I just feel like this is a whole ritual happening, or that it was something that really happened, and they're making a ritual out of it.
It's crazy.
Well, and what also kind of gets me is, this one thing happens but this has been going on with the soccer overseas.
But nobody made like such a production out of that, right?
And we're looking at, depending on the list you look at, it's over 1,000 up to 1,400 that they're saying this has happened to, and not a peep from what's supposed to be the fourth pillar of democracy to inform the citizens so that they can make informed choices in regard to their governance.
The watchdog of the government is not watching.
No. Well, and who watches the watchdogs? That's got to be us.
Supposed to be.
Yeah. But that's the whole thing. When they take anybody that has more information that they want to deal with, and they throw this idea of conspiracy theory on them. It's interesting psychological phenomenon, and I just think that term is, when somebody uses it, that they are presenting one of the most anti-educational statements that a person can make. It's like it's a shut down the conversation, to disallow the expression of ideas, to basically say you're a kook, and we know that this was through the Freedom of Information Act, was introduced, as a form of shutting down the opposition, So it's again back to theater. It's in the theater of war, essentially. It's yeah. So let's get into ISIS here. Okay, so in the early days of Egypt, right, there was this goddess called Sopdet, Sopdet, and she was known as the triangle, or the sharp one. And she used the solar calendar, and she kept the year with the celebration of what they called the Wep Rennet, the Wep Rennet, right? And this was essentially the new year, the Egyptian New Year. And as a goddess, she was based around fertility and the yearly flood of the Nile and the rise of Sirius, the dog star. And she was also a psychopomp who, the Soptet, guided the deceased pharaohs through the Egyptian underworld, right? And eventually, this Soptet was completely absorbed by the mystical Isis, and was how ISIS took on a lot of what most people think she is now, right? Going back to this Sopdet. So let's see. And she as well was associated with the flood. ISIS was, and was also following Sirius, being the resurrector of the Egyptians. And now the Egyptians, they would make small mummies, right? And this is later on, after the death of Osiris, right? But they would make these small mummies that would be filled with corn. And then they would water these corn dollies, or these corn little mummies. And when the corn would sprout forth, they would essentially see that as Horus being risen anew through this little corn edifice, And corn, you have to figure corn in Egyptian times. A lot of people more relate it to wheat, but we do actually have in Egyptian bas relief carvings on walls actual cobs of corn. And so that, in a way, shows the link between South America and the Mayans and the ancient races that were there. Also bringing from South America, they brought the pineapple, and they also brought cocaine with them to. Oh yeah, and when they would embalm the pharaohs, they would actually, I think it was the heart. They would actually put the heart in a cocaine solution in an apothecary jar to put in but the cocaine was part of the ritual function of the embalming of the pharaohs.
Kept the heart pumping.
Yeah.
That's so funny.
Now also, the urn, as far as within the Isis mystery, right? And Isis being linked in with the dog star, the urn, our modern word for urn, URN, is related to the URM of Egypt, right? And so during the inundation of the flood of the Nile, where the Nile was at its highest measurement in the city of Elephantine, it generally measured consistently at about 28 erms, is what they would call it, right? And they related that directly with the moon and the 28 days of the cycle of the turning of the moon, right? And they said that the flood of the Nile would actually depend upon the turning of the moon and the cycle that it was in during the turning. And so the potential of it being higher or lower was based on the moon in the current form it was in, and then also based on the height of the Nile as it was flooding at Elephantine. They would measure it, and depending on if it were higher, they would charge more taxes because they could grow more crops because it was bringing in more silt to fertilize the crops. Whereas if it was lower than 28 urns, then they would tax a lower amount because they believed it was harder to grow stuff because fertility would be down. So, you know, Isis is linked in with this whole idea of this cyclic flood and the generation of the black silt that it brought in, allowing, you know, the vegetation to grow for the feeding of the population. So she has deep links with agriculture and the turning of the cycle and the flood and the coming of the waters, and yeah.
And you said a black silt type of stuff?
Yeah. So when the Nile would flow, when it was flood from the rains, as the rains were coming down. So let's see, the top of Egypt is in the south, right? So the bottom of Egypt is in the north. So when we talk about inversion, a lot of times, Egypt, the Nile flowed from the north to the south, right? So as it would rain in the north, this would, like, you know, kick up a lot of the soil and disturb, you know, everything. And that would flow into the riverbanks. And so it would develop this silt that was basically the most recent broken down plant matter, you know, from where the rains were. And that would wash into the river and it would flow down into Egypt, right? And it was during the time of Mizraim where Mizraim essentially set up these walls around the fields in Egypt. So as the flood would come, it would overflow the walls. And then once the flood would settle down, it would capture like giant pools of water everywhere, you know, basically for these fields, for the crops. And all that recently broken down plant matter from, you know, that had accumulated from the north and flowed down into Egypt would settle into the fields. And that would basically be the fertilizer for the fields.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then they would scatter the seeds and let the pigs run, you know, wild on the fields to basically push the seeds down into, and that's where we talked about earlier in the show about the pig herders, you know, who weren't allowed in the mysteries. And once a year they would eat the pig, you know, as a force generator to Osiris in the underworld to push the crops, you know, so they would grow more healthily, you know? Yeah.
Interesting. I just saw a post like the other day about questioning about pigs and like eating pork, because in like the Bible, the pig is the one animal that like is referred to in a passage where demons enter the field of pigs.
Yeah.
And like the herd of pigs, and then they all run off a cliff.
And he runs them off the cliff. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, is there something up with pigs that makes them, like, I don't know, more susceptible to that?
If you go back into some of the Persian beliefs, there's actually one line of thought that they are actually from past epochs, a form of a genetically mutated human.
Yeah, I've heard
Yeah,
that
yeah.
before as
So,
well. And is that why we're told not to eat it in like the Old Testament?
right, right. It's and all the Muslims, the Muslims don't eat pork at all.
No.
And there is a large, thing with the trigonosis worm that if you don't cook it long enough,
Yes.
that basically that can give you some pretty severe arthritis, you know. But yeah, the pig is an interesting creature. They're smarter than dogs. It's yeah, yeah. So
Sorry,
now,
cut you off
no,
topic.
no, not at all. So now it was the days around mid-July to late August, um, and we had where they had many feasts to Sirius and Isis, watching the dog star, the bright and shining star, which the Masons actually call Merca, right? So it's one of the oldest references to what I see as analogous to America, being yeah, Merca. And it also kind of links in maybe with Merkaba. But let's see. And this is the same 5-pointed star that we see on crests, at least to the Masons. They represent Sirius as a 5-pointed star. And it basically has like little waves generating out of it. But the Masonic star is a direct reference to this dog star that the mysteries of Isis basically revolved around. So let's see. And when this would happen in the inundation of the Nile, this was also what we still call today essentially the dog days of summer, because Sirius was the dog or the dog star, right? So and this dog star cycle took 1,461 years in its full cycle, basically taking 19 cycles for one turning of the great sky clock or the Platonic year or the turning of the ages. So this Sirius cycle would take 19 cycles of 1,461 years to facilitate one full turning of the Sirius cycle.
Oh.
So, and also we have Sirius being the dog star also directly gives us our word sophos. So if that has any meaning.
I don't even know what that word means.
I think it relates to sophistry.
Yeah, like wisdom, right?
Oh, okay. Oh,
Yeah.
all right.
Well, sophistry would be like we had in the encyclopedists, where they would go in and run, it back into Plato even. He called the sophists the traveling salesman. So it gets into these people, these merchant class, and again we see coming out of Chaldea, Isis involved in the Chaldean mysteries, saying that she was born, that she was the eldest child of Saturn in the Chaldean mysteries. So how can we tie that into to the ideas of Geb and Nut, the earth and the sky? It doesn't necessarily match up. But a lot of these things don't. It's interesting. We more drift on the things that do match up than, I don't know. As humans, I think we're pattern recognition machines. So we have a tendency to, group patterns in patterns. It's yeah.
Well, I could even say from my own experience when it comes to magic and occultism, things that didn't seem to like fit the pattern. When I realized why maybe that idea or that symbol or that archetype does, it did seem to be a much more much deeper of an understanding.
How many layers deep it is.
Yeah. To where it's like, all right, I could understand why I never would have thought that from the beginning.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and then if you understand all these symbols,
it becomes much more true to you also, I think.
Well, from the personal individual thing, it's one thing. But for the merchant class, the Merkers, those who worship Mercury or Hermes, going back to Thoth, these Merkers, these worshipers of Mercury, if you know all these symbols, then you keep that knowledge hidden, then you're more apt to be able to play with information, to be able to manipulate, which lends to sophistry.
You know, it's funny. I've often thought that the Devil Tarot card might be showing that in a sense. Because sometimes you see him, he will be up on like a box almost. Oh, yeah. Almost like up on a pedestal or his soapbox. And I'm like, is this like showing you like the people who have the knowledge and manipulate? Because you got people sitting down there with chains on that could take them off and think that they're locked up.
Well, and what's the box he's sitting on? That's our reality. That's the three-dimensional realm that we're in. You know?
Yeah.
So same thing with the Baphomet on a black cube, you know?
The box, the cube.
Yeah, the cube. Yeah, that's a whole show, man. It's a whole...
Again, that's theater.
Yeah, theater. Yeah.
Theater, you stand on a stage, which is a giant rectangle, basically.
Well, and in England, because they don't have free speech, they actually have to go down to Hyde Park, and they have the soapbox where they'll get up on the soapbox, and once they're on top of the box, they can say anything they want, and they can't be persecuted, right? So this is where the terminology of, you know, a person getting on their soapbox comes from.
That's so crazy.
You know? Yeah.
So funny.
So now, let me see if I can pronounce this. Apuleius, who was a Greek philosopher, right? He went to Egypt to be initiated in the mysteries of Isis. And he tells us that Isis appeared to him and told him that the first of the celestials and the uniform manifestation of the gods and goddesses, whose one sole divinity, the whole orb of the earth venerated, and under a manifold form with different rites and under a variety of appellations, she declares herself to be at once Pes and Utica, the mother of all gods. So within these mysteries, and we do see even Isis herself making this proclamation from a stele that Alexander the Great found, where she actually, in that stele, it runs through all the different names throughout the lands that are all these goddesses in all these different lands. And she says that, but for those that know me in my true form, in the Egyptian or the Ethiopian, call me by my true name, Queen Isis. So Isis, essentially being the first of the four physical gods in manifestation, is claiming that she is the goddess that produced all of the gods, and that all these gods and all these other lands are just her under another name. You know,
even in ceremonial magic, and I'm almost positive the reason I even look at it this way as well is because it's probably in Crowley 777, but Isis will be looked at on the moon, which is the ninth sphere, and she will be looked at also as Isis on her throne at Binah, which would be the first feminine sphere, really, and the top one on the left.
On the pillar.
Yeah, I mean, that's like the top, head feminine sphere right there. So that's showing you the same thing, I think, what you're just saying right there, how there's different versions of her. And like I had said to you before, I sometimes wonder, now you have that, and now in the middle you have Venus is taking Hathor kind of just in between that story and taking it out, putting it to the side, and now this is her before she gave birth or got impregnated. Which is now Isis in the moon. Isis,
Well, And when she's incarnated into the moon, you know, it's that we talked about it before, is that Madame Blavatsky, how she talked about she becomes crystallized, where she becomes the insane sidereal mother that she's locked in form, basically, you know, in that lower aspect of herself, you know, in the moon, in silver, essentially, you know. So now Mother Isis, she is related to the serpent power of regeneration, like we talked about, the serpent shedding its skin symbolically. And this idea resurrected the earth every spring with the new shoots and the flooding of the Nile, announced by the dog or the dog star. And even Thoth was called dog-faced. So, but let's see. So the Virgin Goddess. Now here we're going to get into the symbols that she carries, as far as the elements that she carries, right? This Virgin Goddess carries in her left hand a sistrum, right? And this is almost a metal rattle that during the ceremonial aspects, as the entity or the god would approach into the realm of the service or the ritual, right? Because they would dedicate the ritual to a god. And as this god would come closer within the ritual, they would rattle the cistern. And the closer the god got, the more they would rattle it. And almost you have to wonder, you know, what that vibrational energy did to facilitate helping that energy move into that space.
That's interesting. During the Catholic Mass, you know how they like ring the bells?
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that's at the moment it's supposed to be like when, you know, the body of Christ becomes
into the
sacrament. Yeah.
Whoa. You know what I think that actually might show, just from my experience, from things that I've looked at. I was actually really, like I said, I was really big into Hathor. I mean, if I could grab it, I have like a statue still like sitting over there. You know, I'm not tossing it out, but like I did a lot of stuff when it came to ceremonial magic with her. And I knew what a sistrum was because I almost tried to make one. Because you can actually make one with like bottle caps and like a real ghetto way. And it's basically like you can make something in the shape of an ankh and throw bottle caps in the middle and you shake it.
Yep, and shake it.
Yeah. But, you know, she's also associated with the mirror. You know, they had mirrors that women, would carry around that was associated with Hathor. Now, when you look at Netzach, she's associated with that, but it's also on the right side, which is the male. That's how I think Lucifer falls into that area. I think the mirror, in a way, is showing like the reflection or seeing the self or being mesmerized by the image. You know, she's also a beautiful naked woman that goes with that thing. Very mesmerizing. And I think the shaking is the sound, which is the male energy, not in form, shooting out somewhere else, going over to Thoth, which is on the 8th sphere. So I think that's how you can actually get the male projective energy, which is sound. You know, it goes out. It's not, it's trapped within these boundaries, but it can go somewhere. People down the road can hear it. You know, so I think it is showing those both energies.
Like male's more action oriented usually.
Yes, but I do think the sistrum, it goes with her, but I also think it shows like, and what I'm getting at, those two bottom spheres in a negative sense, I think is showing you how you are being controlled through sight and sound.
Right. So now the other item that she held in her right hand, we see sometimes, not all the time, but it's a symbol that, like the triangle is a symbol, right? And you hit it with, and it resonates, right? Now the symbol that Isis holds in some incarnations is actually a square symbol, right? And it was tuned to the key of Fa, which is said to be the intonation of nature itself, right? So when she would ring this square symbol, it was representative basically of the idea that all that vibrates within the cube, all of nature that vibrates within the cube is within her reign. So she is manifesting nature and bringing the God form in, as nature within nature. It's
I sometimes look at like the male energy kind of being like sound, or like almost like a fluid type of thing of water. And then then you have the Scarlet Whore, or the Scarlet Witch. I do think, in a sense, she fits on almost every every sphere, because like each sphere is her taking that energy and putting it into a new form.
Yep.
And then the lanes, or the lines going from one sphere to the next, is basically the male energy breaking free again, and then being put into another shell or another cup.
Right. Well, and it's like
sometimes, like when you see those waterfalls going from one thing to the next, that's exactly what I think is going on with the spheres.
Well, and it's like we've talked about in the past, as far as the crone, you have the old, the middle-aged, and then the young. And when you get into a lot of these alchemical writings, and they talk about the children, the young man, the old man, it's all different levels of moving between these different energetic forces and how they interact with one another.
That's why Metallica said in The Unforgiven, the old man standing there was him. He was looking at a reflection of himself, in a different time.
Yeah. But I think fundamentally what that really comes down to, when you get into all this stuff, it's just observing nature and how things naturally work, and then seeing those systems, and then incorporating that into a system of magic. Essentially, creating the Kabbalah, or the Kabbalah, and the Tree of Life, and bringing forth this map. So now, and that's with this vibration. I have here, by process of death, she gives life to a number of creatures of diverse forms through time and its periodical change. So that's essentially what we were just saying, the various forms through time and their change.
So I think it's almost like if you were to watch character arcs, like we mentioned before in The Walking Dead. You could take one of these characters and look at who they were throughout that whole show. They're not the same person at all, but yet they are. So like I even think you see that going along in occultism. Sometimes we might change the name, but it's the same type of thing. It's just showing you like a different type or a stage in their life, a different vibrational change in between, going from one thing to the next.
Yeah, and even like Ecclesiastes in the Bible, a season
it's just
for
like
everything.
Archetypes morphing from one into the next.
Yeah, the song, to everything, turn, right?
Right.
Yeah.
A time and a time for everything in its own season.
Exactly.
Yeah. So now we're going to get into Osiris. Now Osiris is much like the Christos, or the Christ, or Jesus, right? And he is, I think, the essential primordial template for the dead and risen God. I think there's probably other characters in the histories that were dead and risen gods, but I think once we get to Osiris, he becomes the template for the modern personifications that we see evolving into the Masons and Catholicism and a lot of the systems that we're under now.
It's a highly used, I think, recognized story.
Yep. And we see Osiris, let's see. So as baby Osiris, he actually has a heart, or a heart-shaped fruit called a perse. And this is just like Vishnu, who wears a sacred heart suspended around his neck. And this is also like we see with Jesus, with the flaming heart as well. I was just
going to say, sacred heart of Jesus is an important symbol,
And we can see, let's see.
One thing I do want to add real quick before you get into this, just the whole dead and risen thing with Osiris. Even like any of the hexagram rituals, It could be the lesser banishing, lesser, greater invoking, whatever it is. As long as you use the LVX formula, you're even, as you're doing that ritual, you're acknowledging the death and rising of Osiris too, within the stuff that you're saying and the movements that you're doing too, and the stuff that you say. So it is something that, and that's like, that may have came from the Golden Dawn, but like, who knows where it came from before that, but. Right. That is highly used. Those are like rituals that it can be, it does, non-denominational to an extent.
Yeah.
A lot of different forms of, different thoughts on magic or different schools or societies can all still use that template.
Yeah, we can kind of get into the idea of Osiris in the sense that he's reborn. Okay. Now there's a Benson, who's a writer. He's an Orientalist. He tells us that when Osiris was reborn as the child, that his name was Linus. And we talked about already the Charlie Brown.
From Peanuts?
Yeah.
Yo, you've heard, Teresa, you've heard me say the thing about Charlie Brown, right? In Saturn, you've heard that?
Oh, yes, with his shirt.
Okay, all right, and the blockhead.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Yes, and the blockhead, yeah.
Right. So Horus resurrected was called Linus and was the husband of his mother. And as Horus, the husband of Isis reborn, he basically, this is Isis's brother, dead and risen again. He becomes Harpocrates, who is Horus the child, right? So when you see that Harpocrates or Harpocrates, that's a reference to Horus.
That's even
a hypocrite.
When you do this. When you do this, sometimes after you're done doing like whatever, like if you're turning to one area, you're drawing your star, your hexagram, and then charging it with whatever. When you go to stop, you go like this at the end.
Yeah.
Silence. That's also the sign of Harpocrates.
Right.
Goes back to Horus again.
Thoth used to do that a lot as well. Yeah.
And real quick, you mentioned something about blue before or something like that.
Oh, I don't know about blue.
Oh, you were saying something. Linus. Did he have a blue blanket?
Yeah.
He had a blue blanket, and then I was also thinking when Crowley supposedly did his invocation to Horus inside the pyramids, he says that it glowed with a blue light.
Right. I bet you if you sat down and went through all the Peanut characters, that you could probably find quite an insane link to all this stuff, man.
Even Peanuts, man.
Yeah. You got to wonder about George Schultz, man.
Charles Schultz, yeah.
Yeah, Charles Schultz.
Yeah.
Did I say George Schultz?
George R. Martin.
Yeah, Charles Schultz.
That's funny.
So now with Osiris, he essentially, when he dies, he becomes the Lord of the underworld or the God of the dead, right? And we can see in other cultures, sun gods that are linked to the sun that are also essentially gods of the underworld or gods of the dead, right? Let's see, we have Baal, who was the storm god. We have Apollo, who is the plague god. And that's just like Osiris, being the god of the dead. So you just have to wonder, with the Egyptian mysteries linked in with the Chaldean mysteries and the merchants, taking this information and spreading it. And I think that's why we see it popping up later, within the Freemasonic, culture. And how that carries over into modern times with all the stars doing the Osiris risen. Yes. And
that's actually what you do that in the LVX formula. You even do that too.
Yeah. And does that relate to the killing of the king ritual, Osiris, as well?
Well, that would be at the point when he's mummified and becomes the god of the dead, essentially. Yeah, so that is, I think, a direct correlation with Osiris in the underworld as the god of the dead.
Got it.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
So, as far as time, let's see, I still have Set and Thoth. So I don't know how the Thoth is going to take a minute. I mean, if you want to stop here and continue later, we can.
Yeah. Because we both also said that I meant to mention in the beginning this will probably be 2 to 3 episodes this series. So
Yeah.
that was another reason why I brought you on, because I knew it wouldn't be one episode. I knew it would be a very detailed, multiple episodes, and I was like, that's perfect for this platform.
Yeah.
So, and I wanted more people to get to hear it. So.
And I think it's also interesting that you have a whole group of people that are interested in listening to this long form information, and then I find that, I go out into the world and I have conversations with people, and I oftentimes get looked at like I'm completely insane because of some of the things that I touch on. But I find that the people that I'm talking to, they don't have the inclination to even want to listen, and they're more interested in when you go back into a lot of the miscellaneous globalist documents and coming down through media, and how they've basically taken the attention span with children and cartoons and movies and stuff down to about 4 seconds. Now, they say that 4 second attention span is actually less than your average goldfish.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
So I really wonder about what they're doing, and that also gets into the strobing. Like if you turn your television on, and we're talking about theater here. This is all about theater. This is all about perception. But if you don't watch the TV, if you turn your back to the TV and you watch the wall, you will see patterns that repeat themselves in how the light pulses.
Or like when you can see your neighbor's TV, going through, just flashing in the dark or something.
Right.
You can notice it.
Well, I've heard some stories about how that's how they drew stuff inside caves, the flashing of light and stuff.
Flashing. Well, the old fires in the caves.
Yeah.
There's one actual. There's a python somewhere in sub-Sahara Africa, I think, that they found inside of a cave, and they carved it in with chit marks. And when you have the fire going inside the cave for the ritual, the python that goes around the whole cave, the way that the fire shines off the chit marks, it actually looks like the python is pulsating and moving. So, and it's the whole idea of, the shadows and the cave of Plato, and I think what we're talking about is inherent natural systems within the world and how those systems operate, which is what all this really comes down to, right? Whereas the theater or the Plato's cave or the reflections on the wall, they're actually harvesting attention and facilitating people's own will towards their achieved goal. You know
what I was going to say? I mean, if you, I know this is going far back when people made that, but I'm sure at some point you're still going to get, I guess, less knowledgeable even before then. Basically what I'm getting at is I don't think it would be too much of a stretch to wonder if that was even was that somebody manipulating people with CGI before computers? Did you know how to use the reflection of light and fire to make that effect? And maybe you thought it was cool, but you're yo, I bet you some people might believe that snake's real.
Yeah.
And you know what I'm saying?
Especially if you're in an altered state of consciousness, and now we're going to initiate you. We're going to take you into the cave, and we're going to show you essentially this cosmic serpent that, and
you
it's
could be telling them I'm invoking this cosmic serpent, and now they start seeing it when you start lighting more candles.
Yeah. Well, and also we know SRI and some of these high level DARPA institutions, they've actually come up with a strobe light pattern that if they throw it in your face, it will reset your brain and you'll actually pass out and you have to reboot.
Yeah, that's some Men in Black stuff now. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's straight up Men in Black.
Yeah.
That's
well, even those purple streetlights coming out. And I've heard of friends who've seen flashes of white or flashes of red. yeah, in the last couple of years. I don't know.
Yeah,
Crazy shit's going on.
I could say some strange stuff about old streetlights back in the day, but
We'll say
Another
that for the
time
next one.
on Spiritual Gangsters.
Yeah, there you go. That's true too.
oh man.
Robbie,
yeah.
do you want to plug your stuff real quick before we wrap this up?
Yeah, you can find my podcast or interviews I've done on other shows, as well as some of my own information at Meta Mindcast, METTA Mindcast. And then also, if you just Google RMarx, MARX artist, I'm on all the major platforms. So
Awesome. Thank you very much. And Teresa, would you like to plug your show as well?
Yeah, please check it out. It's called Spiritual Gangsters on all the major podcast platforms and YouTube. And yeah, come check it out.
Thank you. And thank you both very much. I had a great time. That was very, a lot of information, a lot of stuff I had no idea about, but I thought we also had great chats where there was stuff I could bounce off of you. And I think in these conversations, it's great because it's like I could see what you're saying in a different way, and I have my way of seeing the same thing. Again, we're just different pieces of the puzzle. Exactly why Teresa's here, because she'll see things from her way. But I think we can all still see a lot of the same stories, just in a different flair, a different art form, different story.
right.
So thank you. I thought this was great, and I'm sure the rest of the series will be as well. And that's the end of Occult Rejects and Friends. Robbie's links are in the bottom, like I said. Teresa's is in my link tree as well. You can find all the stuff in there because I am the co-host. The link's in there also in my link tree. So, you can find all that there. And, until the next one, everybody be well. Later.